Welcome to another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are archived. You can find them at artistfirst.com. And now, from England, here she is, your host, Deborah Ruffini.
Greetings from England. This is Deborah Ruffini with another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show. Today it is my absolute pleasure to be speaking again with the amazing Nancy Little, survivor of childhood abuse, now motivational speaker. Nancy, in her own words, has had a life of horror turned into a life of honour. I think Nancy is probably the bravest person I've ever had the privilege of speaking with. A true fighter, true trooper. And Nancy, great to have you with us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Thank you so much for being on again. It's always lovely to speak with my friend, but you're such an inspiration to so many with... Sadly, awful things happen to people in order to help others, isn't it? It's very sad. But so we spoke, I think it was crumbs. Do you know, it was about 2 years ago. Sorry.
2 years ago, May.
Was it? Oh, okay.
Yes, yes.
It's like the anniversary, second anniversary of our... It'll have to be a yearly thing.
Exactly.
Oh, so how have things been for you since we last spoke?
It's been good. I've had probably 4 or 6 surgeries since then, so...
Wow.
That always keeps me busy.
Oh, crumbs. That must be very exhausting, to say the least.
It can be. I just try to focus on each one and not look too far in the future, because if you do, that can kind of get depressing.
Yeah, it's a good job we don't know what the future holds with things like that, isn't it? So when was your last surgery?
The last one was, this is 2021. So I had surgery in January. I had one last July. I had one last January before that. So those are the 3 that I can think of offhand.
Crumbs.
And they've all been hand surgeries, every single one of them.
Have they?
Had to replace the prostheses that they put in my knuckles and in my hand. They keep breaking.
Oh.
And all of that is due to my diagnosis as a child with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis.
Yeah. Oh, how awful. It's a horrid thing to go through, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it's part of something I deal with, because I wasn't allowed to have any kind of medical treatment for it growing up. So by the time I was 18, 19 years old, the damage had been done to the joint. So that's why I've had now 77 surgeries to either replace or fuse my joint.
That's a heck of a
lot.
And
I've become quite vocal on a couple juvenile rheumatoid arthritis groups on online, because I feel like the one thing that I can do is share my story with others and encourage parents today to make sure that they seek the appropriate help and not to just ignore it or hope it'll go away like my parents did.
Yeah. What was that? Was that a mixture of lack of concern or disbelief in getting attention sought for this? It was
more that they felt like the only way to treat it was to pray to God, and if God didn't heal you, then there was something in your life, or you were doing some type of sin.
Oh, yeah.
That kept you from being healed. My parents drugged me to every faith healer they could find in 250 miles as a child growing up. The one thing they didn't do was have it medically treated as a child. They did have it diagnosed, and the only reason they had it diagnosed was the school I attended told them to either find out what the problem was or not bring me back. And this was in an age that there was no homeschooling. So they kind of, forced my parents to find out what was wrong, but they couldn't force them to have it treated. So I was 5, maybe an early 6-year-old when they had it diagnosed. But then from that point on, they didn't do anything to help the arthritis not damage my joints. There was no treatment from that point on.
Was there never any consideration of God maybe working through the hands of the medical profession?
Well, that's what I believe, but no, they didn't. The denomination that we went to at the time taught that the way, if you were sick, then you had laying on hands, and you came down for a prayer service at night when they had their healing services. And that's what was taught. Luckily, the denomination that we belong to has since changed that viewpoint, but at the time it did a lot of damage, for people like me who had a very serious illness.
Yeah. It's almost like...
And it also emotionally damaged me for a very long time, because I believed that, because I wasn't being healed, that I must have been doing something really bad because God wasn't healing me, and that wasn't the case. But that is the message that viewpoint sends to a child.
Yeah. That's natural, isn't it? I mean, I know of a case of someone who was in a wheelchair. I didn't know the person, but people laying on of hands with this lady, and they said, if only you had enough faith, sister, you would leap out of your chair. And she actually she left the church because she felt that she was a failure as a Christian.
Right, exactly. That's what that teaches, unfortunately. And I am a Christian, and
absolutely
have a lot of faith, but I also know God works through doctors and nurses and other health professionals.
Yeah.
And that healing can look differently depending on how you look at it, too.
Yeah.
I don't think that just because you aren't instantly healed doesn't mean God isn't working through you. He may put you into somebody's life who has a similar experience and needs to see what you've gone through.
Yeah.
Because that can give that person hope. I mean, God can work through many different ways, not necessarily just the instant healing. But when we have this attitude that no, if you go to a doctor, there's something wrong with you, we're sending the wrong message there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just thinking, wasn't there an apostle that was a doctor? Was it Luke who was a doctor? There's one apostle that was a doctor, wasn't there?
Yeah, I'm not sure which one it was, but yeah, I believe there was.
So, it's not, this whole sort of the kingdom pill for every ill attitude is it's very, as you say, very damaging.
Well, thankfully, a lot of churches have moved away from that teaching, but when I grew up, it was definitely had a profound effect on my life. I've met a lot of people who were treated. I'm 61, so the treatments that they had back for juvenile rheumatoid arthritis isn't what it is today, but they still had treatment. And they're on their 5th or 6th surgery, and I'm on my 77th.
Crumbs.
So there's still a huge discrepancy between those who were treated back then and those of us who weren't.
Yeah.
And it would have saved me a lot of pain and anguish had I gotten the treatment that I needed.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. It's hard to... what's amazing to me is that you you could have grown bitter and you could have easily become an atheist. Where was God in all of this? You know, that God must have done a disappearing act. But the fact that it sounds like your faith has grown stronger, probably because you met a different God.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, my sister and I have seen many of the kids, you know, that are now adults that we grew up with, for various reasons, all left the church.
Oh.
And a lot of it just has to do with, you know, everything that seemed to be fun was a sin, everything. And I spoke a little bit about that in the first interview. You know, we weren't allowed to go to movies. We weren't allowed to play card games. We weren't allowed to go to dances. We weren't allowed to wear pants. I mean, it was just nonstop rules about what you couldn't do, and not a lot about what you could do.
No.
Everything was based on a negative. You know, this is wrong. This is a sin.
Yeah.
And when that's all you teach, you get a very skewed idea about what God is and what faith is.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know, it's interesting you say that, because I was thinking of you all throughout reading this book. I've just recently finished the autobiography of Megan Phelps Roper, who was thankfully an escapee of the Westboro Baptist Church with her sister. And she says a very similar thing. You know, she's now happily married with a child, or two, one child. And, you know, everything was wrong there. They had to have their hair a certain way, and they weren't allowed to marry, like as you mentioned.
No jewelry, no makeup.
Yeah.
The list was endless.
Oh, it must have been...
It just was endless.
It's almost like being scared to breathe.
Well, I went, when I was 15, I spent the summer with my sister and her first husband and their first child, and they took me to see my first movie.
Oh.
And, you know, it's funny to think now, but back then, you know, I literally thought that somebody could look in my face and know I've done this terrible sin by going to a movie. And we went to see Rocky.
Oh, did you? Excellent.
But, you know, I just, because of the way I had been taught, you know, I thought that I was going to hell because I had gone to a movie and God was going to strike me dead at any moment. And, you know, it sounds funny to think that, but when you've been taught that, you live in fear constantly.
Yeah, and I guess there was the whole sort of thief. I don't know if you had I think it was an American movie, A Thief in the Night. There was all this whole thing about what if the Lord returns when you're in a pub, or what if he returns in the cinema when you're watching Rocky.
See, that was taught. Was a big teaching factor in the Assembly of God Church growing up.
Oh.
We were taught about the rapture. We were taught that God is coming back at any moment, and that you better watch out what you're doing because you don't want to be caught playing cards, wearing pants, going to movies.
Sorry. Yeah.
You know, all this list of no-nos if God returns, because, you know, then you're not going to go to heaven. He's not going to take you.
Yeah.
So I remember as a child in a store, you know, when I lost track of my mother or my dad or my sister momentarily, and literally feeling like and thinking, oh my gosh, God's returned and I'm left here by myself. I mean, it's a terrifying feeling when that's the way you've been taught from the time you can walk.
Yeah, I can get that. I always used to be scared that he'd return when I was on the toilet.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But no, I can...
mean, it'd be even worse if he returned and you were at a movie or you were having fun. I mean, because fun wasn't something that was really taught.
No.
You know, my that goes along with the, you know, kind of the abusive home life that I grew up in, but my parents didn't believe that children needed very much playtime. We weren't allowed to just go out and ride bikes at random, or, you know, if we went outside, it was for very short periods of time because they just didn't believe that play was necessary for children. But that's how children learn.
Yeah. So was it? It wasn't just fun, as in, it was ungodly because dancing. You could have met a boy, or going to the pictures. There may have been swearing, and it was absolutely spotless fun, as in going.
Right. Because there were endless TV shows that made the list that we weren't allowed to watch. We weren't allowed to watch the Brady Bunch because the girls wore short dresses. We weren't allowed to watch them because they went to a school dance. We stopped watching Marcus Welby, MD, because they had an episode with the unmarried woman. So the list just grew longer and longer.
Yeah.
Because they were afraid if we saw this one thing, that was just going to corrupt us forever, and we wouldn't get to heaven.
But how tragic that all the emphasis on this while the abuse is going on, and that's been completely overlooked, and God isn't against that.
Oh, and that's what made it so confusing as a child.
Yeah.
You're brought up to not lie, but yet, you're told to tell the bill collector when they call that mom and dad isn't home. Well,
yeah.
Isn't that a lie when they're standing behind the door?
Yeah.
It's something that we did often. It's very confusing, for me as a child to know when it was okay and when it wasn't okay. You are taught to always be dressed and never to entice a boy, yada, 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 but then your mother's coming into your room at night and you're waking up with her hand down your underwear.
Oh, crumbs.
So how do you compute that? How do you weigh that as a child when you think about those two things? For me, I dissociated because that was the only way that my mind could compute these two different things.
Mm.
So if I put the abuse kind of like behind a door and just did my best to never think about it, then it made it easier to deal with the other parts of life.
Yeah, I can see the logic in that. Was it almost... From your mum, was it almost a sense of entitlement that you came out of her, you were sort of her appendix, if you like? She was entitled to touch your body, she was entitled to do what she pleased because you belonged to her?
Oh, yes. I mean, from the moment I could breathe. I know when I first started dealing with the memories of the sexual abuse, I was early college student. 19, 20 years old.
Right.
And I remember making the comment once to my therapist that I didn't know where, like, as far as my mother was concerned, it was like we weren't two separate people.
Oh. Yeah.
Because she felt like I 100% belonged to her. And even my dad had very much the same attitude in the sense that, I mean, he was the one who initially threw a fit when I first talked about moving out, of my parents' home as a college student and getting my own place. And even after I was married and had a child, when we moved out of the state of Texas where my parents lived, and my father told me again, it was my job to stay there and take care of my mother. So even he had the idea that, and I don't know where that idea came from, but he always had that idea that I had to stay there and take care of my mother. Well, that wasn't my job.
No.
He married her. He was the husband. It was his job to take care of her. It wasn't my job.
Was your dad kind of scared of his wife that he would just sort of go along?
Most definitely.
So he would just sort of go along with anything she said to just keep the peace at the expense of your...
To keep the peace, and not really at the expense of everybody. Well, I mean, it obviously ended up being at the expense of my sister and I, but it was more not for our sake. It was so to make it easier for him.
Oh, okay.
He would literally drive up when I can remember this from the time I was 5, 6 years old. He would drive up, come in the house, and in the early evening, ask what kind of mood Mother was in, and if we said she was in one of her moods, which is how we talked about, her raging and her yelling and her screaming and all of that, he would literally just walk back out to the car and say, well, tell your mother I won't be home for dinner. I've got work to do. And he would leave. So if it made it difficult for him, then he would leave. Everything revolved around him. It wasn't, well, I need to stay there and protect you girls.
Yeah.
It was, well, this is hard for me, so I need to go until she calms down.
Oh, so it wasn't one lot of abuse from one parent. It was both of them.
Oh, definitely. I know that the sexual abuse, starts and ends with her as far as the responsibility, but he also had a responsibility to take care of his 2 daughters.
Yeah.
He was also dealing with her rages and dealing with her, coming into our room at night. She definitely had a lot of OCD behavior. She would yank us up out of a deep sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning because the wash rag was a 1/4 inch uneven, or she felt the baseboards needed to be scrubbed. And while all this just sounds unbelievably asinine, that's what we lived with, and we never knew we could go a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks with, everything being pretty calm, and then she would just erupt for no reason and yank us out of bed, yelling and screaming. The hairbrush was turned over. It had to be turned a certain way. The Crest toothpaste, you had to be able to read it with the words on it. Oh. And if we had turned the tube backwards, she would yank us out of bed screaming because we did it wrong, where you couldn't read it. Like everybody didn't already know that was the toothpaste. Did it really matter?
Yeah. Do you know what's coming into my mind? Sorry.
I was just going to say, and then I would fall asleep during school as a young child, a first grader, second grader, and then I would end up getting in trouble at home because the teacher would call my mother and say, well, Nancy's falling asleep at school. I was falling asleep at school because I'm getting yanked out of bed at 2 and 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But nobody ever bothered to ask, hey, why are you falling asleep? Or why is this child continuously falling asleep in class? We don't, teachers, a lot of them still don't take the time to ask the child what might be going on. They may directly go straight to the parent, but if the parent is the one causing the problem, you could be making that problem worse, as in my case. So going directly to my mother and talking to her only made her angrier.
Yeah, it was a catch-22. Yeah.
Right, it was. It was this endless cycle of kind of going around in circles.
Dear, oh dear.
And then moving often as we didn't help that because we had no consistency with teachers.
Yeah.
And we might be there 6 weeks, we might be there 3 months, we might be there 30 days. As when I was 15, I went to 3 different high schools in 1 year.
Wow. That is really... Do you know what's coming into mind? I'm thinking of Misery with Annie Wilkes, where, I can't remember the author's name, but he never knew what he was going to get with her, did he? It was,
that's what made it so confusing as a child, because she could snap and just, I mean, you could be having a normal conversation and you could see this instant fluttering of her eyes almost, and her personality just completely do a 360-degree turn.
Mm.
And as a child, that was extremely confusing because you're standing there going, well, what changed from a minute ago? Everything was fine a minute ago.
Do you think, I mean, conditions weren't recognised then? It rather sounds a bit like borderline personality disorder. Do you think there was, or multiple personality disorders going on?
To be honest, I don't know. I know that when she was hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital when I was 19, she was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic.
Oh.
But she wasn't. She was on the medication for a month, 2 months tops, and my dad stopped buying the medication. And I mean, she was the most normal I'd ever seen her during the time she was on the medication.
Yeah.
But as soon as she stopped the medication, she just went back to the raging person that she was before that.
Shame she couldn't have stayed on that continuously, isn't it?
Well, I mean, yes, in hindsight, it doesn't surprise me, you know, given the way the church and how they spoke about mental health, because in the era that I grew up in, if you had a mental disorder, that was just another reason that they would say you don't have enough faith.
Yeah.
And so I know that even in early 2000, my mother had a conversation with a pastor because she had always suffered depression, and there was a book on her coffee table about it, and the pastor told her that she needed to put that away. If she just had enough faith, she wouldn't be depressed.
Oh, it's so damaging, isn't it?
It's very damaging, but that is the mindset that I grew up in with. If you're not perfect, then you just don't have enough faith. There's something wrong with you.
But it's just, apart from that, it's just not scriptural, is it? I mean, it's just sort of evidence of people make the gospel according to them.
Yes.
You know, and it's almost like saying that we're dealing with an unemotional God if he doesn't allow us feelings or, you know,
well,
emotions.
See, we were not taught to have any feelings other than happiness, because if you're not happy, then you're not seeking God's will. We were not taught about anger, sadness, depression, any of the other emotions that God gives us, and God gives us these emotions for a reason.
Yeah.
But we were taught that the only expression of emotions you need to show is happiness. And they equated that with, if you're happy, then you're okay with God. You're aligned with Him. And if you're anything but happy, there's something wrong with you. You don't have enough faith. You're not spiritual enough. You don't pray enough, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you have something like sexual abuse in our family, if you have something like domestic violence in our family, then, you know, we certainly can't talk about that, because that would mean you're not okay. So all of these things just get the door shut on it. You're taught not to talk about it. I mean, our dad, that's the one thing our dad taught us from the time my sister and I could walk and talk, is everything that happened at home stays at home. You're not to talk to anybody in the church about what happens at home, you know. So as a young child, I remember the cops coming to our door when my dad would beat my mother. Next morning, we'd get up, sit at the table, eat our cereal, Nobody spoke about what happened the night before. It was never talked about. It's like it just didn't happen, and that's confusing to a young child because you start doubting everything at that point.
Yeah.
You know, did I remember this correctly or not?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
and if I do, then why didn't somebody ever talk about it? So you start thinking to yourself, well, that must not have happened. That must have been a wrong memory, because if it had happened, somebody would have, said something about it.
Yeah.
So you start downing everything in your life at that point because your memories aren't computing with what people are talking about.
Yeah, that's Yeah, I get that. That makes sense. But it's almost like they were producing a first cause and blaming you for the effects. So, they produce the first cause to make you unhappy and then blame you that you're not happy.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Very messed up. It's terribly messed up.
It is messed up, and that's why eventually, at first I thought, when I married and had our daughter, that I would be able to raise her in the same state that my parents lived in. My husband and I moved about 250, 300 miles away from my parents, and thought that would be enough distance. But as I quickly found out after I had my daughter, my dad would just put my mother on the plane and call me up and say, hey, your mom's coming out for a 2-week visit. Pick her up at the airport. And so I learned very quickly that wasn't enough distance to be able to put them kind of, out of sight, out of mind, so to speak. And so we ended up literally moving several states away, and we stayed that way and have stayed that way for the last 35 years. That was the only way that I could escape the chaos of what I grew up with.
Oh, thank goodness.
And that was a big part of why I was able to start my journey of healing and getting past the way I was raised. It was by putting some distance between us.
Yeah. So it was never it was never a question, is it okay if Mum comes and visits you? It was, you were being told that she would come and visit you.
Oh, no. I mean, even when I had a big elbow surgery when we lived in Florida, after we had left the state of Texas, I had told my dad, I said, this is going to be a long surgery. It was one of the surgeries I almost died from. It was supposed to be a 3-hour surgery, turned into a 10-hour surgery.
Crumbs.
And I wake up to find my parents standing over my bed. I had already told my dad, do not come. I need the time to be able to heal and not entertain people.
Yeah.
They came anyway.
No respecting you. Crumbs.
Me setting a boundary didn't mean anything to my dad. That was, boundaries is a word that he just never heard or respected. And it took a lot of work after that point to get him to understand, if I set a boundary between us, I need you to honor it.
Yeah.
Because in his mind, he was still the dad, and whatever he wanted was basically the Word of God in his eyes. So we were never asked if, is this okay that we do this? He just did it if he wanted to do it. But that gives the child, whether you're a child or an adult, it still gives them the same message, which is, you're not important. What's important is what I say.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's always convenient when people say, God's told me so. You think, oh, crumbs, where can we go with that? It's just, it's that's very convenient, isn't it? It's very manipulative if God's told them.
My dad said that often when we were fixing to move. He would sit my sister and I down and say, well, I was up for 12 hours last night praying, and God told us, we need to move to so-and-so. And I used to think, well, that's funny because God didn't tell me the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
You know, he didn't tell my sister and I that, but somehow it took 16 hours, you know, of my dad praying about it, that that's what we needed to do. But,
Yeah.
You know, he just didn't bother to share that with me.
No. I find it really interesting how quite often God seems to tell people what they want to do anyway.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
convenient, I find it.
Yeah. That's very... So, I mean, did you never ever received an ounce of apology from either Ma or Pa?
No, years ago, sat down and had a long discussion with my dad and asked him what he would change, and he said nothing.
Oh.
That pretty well just, you know, my dad, you know, he had some moments that we had some good times. We had more good times with him than obviously with my mother, but he still had a responsibility to protect his children, which he failed to do.
Yeah.
And he had things that he could have done that would have made it easier, you know, that he didn't do.
Yeah.
In my early 30s, this was back when cassette tapes were popular. He made me a tape of just some thoughts about my childhood growing up, and on the tape he talked about what used to just break my heart to hear Mother beat you and Jeannie in the other room at 2 o'clock in the morning. It just broke my heart to hear that, but it didn't break his heart enough to get up and stop it.
No. What was his justification for not getting involved?
That it would just make Mother angrier, but that's an easy out.
Yeah.
Not you that's being hurt. And he always, I think, viewed children as less than. I mean, I think I talked about this on our first interview, which was he would tell me that, well, you really won't become a person until you turn 18. And that he really didn't like children younger than 13. Well, I'm sorry, Dad, but, you know, kids tend to be born as infants.
Yeah. Yeah.
And tend to grow up that way. And whether you really like children or not, the fact that you made two with your wife means that you have a responsibility to take care of them. Not just when she's not pissed at you, but all the time. And when you know that she's going to rage as soon as you walk out the door, I don't understand the justification how you can leave two young children who can't defend themselves. You were an adult. You could walk out the door, but what were we supposed to do?
Yeah.
We didn't have that luxury. We couldn't just leave.
No. And I don't suppose there would have been the same child protection services back then, would there?
Well, they did not have child protection services until I was 10 in the U.S.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So the first 10 years, the only recourse they had would have been to either call the police or call the Humane Society for Animals, which they did have, which is really sad that they had an agency for that before we had a way to protect our children.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's very sad, yeah. Oh, my goodness. So, sorry, do you mind me asking, how long has it been since your mum and dad have passed?
Yeah, my mom passed in 2007 and my dad in early 2009.
Yeah. How did you feel with both deaths? I mean, did you...
My mom she passed, surprisingly. I was talking to her on the phone. We'd made plans for the next day.
Yeah.
And I got a call from the place where she lives saying she had been rushed to the hospital, and she died apparently cooking something.
Oh, right.
And I mean, she was late, early 80s, so they didn't do an autopsy or anything. They just, ruled it as old age, I guess.
Yeah.
So I, wasn't expecting hers. And honestly, I mean, my sister and I didn't shed a tear at the funeral.
Yeah.
The person that was in the casket there was never a true, quote, mom.
No.
She was never the Leave It to Beaver type, which was a show that we had in the U.S. when I was a kid. She wasn't a type of mom that you see Mother's Day cards about. To us, she was pretty much just a momster.
Yeah.
A mom and last monster. And my dad, it was twofold, because there were some good times with him. The good memories I have were things that I did with my dad.
Yeah.
He was a umpire for baseball when I was a kid growing up, and often on July 4th we would go and spend the day at the park, and my sister and I would be watching baseball, and we were girls in the 60s, and we knew more about baseball than most boys did at the time.
Oh, wow.
Because we would go with our dad and spend the day at the baseball park. And those were good times. But, there were also times that it wasn't so good, and when we weren't protected, and when he did leave, and, tears would be running down my face, and I'd be begging him, please don't leave me home alone with her during the summer. Please let me go to work with you, because he could have taken me to work. He did often. He threw newspapers for a living.
Yeah.
And so I could ride with him in the truck, and occasionally he would take me with him, but most of the time, I was stuck at home with Mother. And, so it was more conflicting, I would say, when my dad died, because I loved him on one hand, but on the other hand, I also felt like he didn't do what he should have done to protect us.
Yeah, and a daddy is supposed to be our superhero, isn't he?
And for many years, that's how I viewed him. I actually viewed him almost as God. When I first started therapy, there was something that I wanted to do, and my dad was insisting I do something else, and my therapist said, you can make a choice, and without even batting an eye, I said, oh, no, you don't understand. My dad is God. What he says goes.
Mm.
And he said, no, it doesn't. And he was the first person. I was 20 years old then.
Yeah.
The first person I ever heard say that I could do something different than what my dad said. Nobody had ever told me that before.
I bet that was a real
I thought, if my dad said to do it, then by goodness, you did it. There was no questioning, It didn't even enter my mind that I could make a choice at this point.
Yeah. Was it a moment of enlightenment when you had received therapy and you realised so many things that, oh, wow, this, was when you were away from that cloud and the control or the manipulation in belief?
Oh, it was. And it was, when I first started therapy, I started it at the college I was at because I could get it free there.
Mm.
And my mother actually worked in the same building, not on the same floor, but I was terrified that somehow she was going to figure out what I was doing there. Because in my mind at the time, my mother and my father both were up there pretty much with God as far as having control over my life.
Yeah.
And so I was terrified that what I said to my therapist was somehow going to get out to her. Looking back, I understand now that that wasn't the case, but when you've grown up in an atmosphere where your parents have 100% control about everything, you live in fear that, they're going to find out everything that's going on, because in your mind, they have that much power.
Yeah. Yeah, and being fearful of your own parents must be must be petrifying. Yeah, that's you're
You
supposed to
know,
feel warmth.
my first bit of taking that power back was moving out.
Was it? Yeah, I bet that was a massive step. Was there part of you even then that felt you were doing wrong?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was terrified that, one, you know, I'd been told all this time by my dad that I would never survive without them being there to tell me what to do.
Ooh.
And so, also, you know, it meant that not only would I be paying for all of my education by myself, which I'd already been doing at that point, but then I would also have to come up with the money for the apartment. You know, when I moved out, I had no TV.
Mm.
I had a small transistor radio, no phone, nothing else besides just the radio. But for the first time, I could go to bed at night, lock my door, and know it stayed locked.
Yeah.
And that my mother wouldn't be coming into my room at night.
Yeah.
So the risk that I was going to take to try to make it, for me, was I had to make it. I just didn't give myself a choice.
Yeah, of course.
You know, once I left, I was not going back.
Yeah, oh, yeah, too right.
So I had to make it. I worked 2 jobs. I babysat at night. I did everything I knew to do that was legal, so that I wouldn't have to ever live back at home.
Yeah. Even then, was there sort of, because when we've had a programming of some sort, it can be hard to break away from that. So things that, like you said, about going to the pictures or watching TV programs of any soap opera has got a line of infidelity or, you know, fornication or whatever. Did part of you still feel sort of programmed that you shouldn't?
Absolutely. It took a while everything from, you know, the first time I wore a pair of jeans.
Oh, yeah.
To, you know, my first concert, you know, that wasn't Christian. Going back to another movie.
Yeah.
I mean, just what most people would take for granted in an ordinary life. For me, you know, there were all these rules that I had grown up with that you can't do. You know, even playing a game of cards made my heart like worry that, you know, I was somehow going to go to hell because I learned how to play a game of cards.
Yeah.
Not even the fact that I was gambling, because I wasn't, but just the fact that I was playing a card game was what worried me. You know, what if they're right? What if I am going to go to hell for that? What if they're right because I wore jeans? You know, that's going to send me straight to hell.
Yeah.
But it took, you know, between therapy and also getting in a good church that didn't teach all these things that weren't biblical, and learning what really was biblical is what broke me out of that fear.
Oh, thank goodness.
You know, but it took a while. It wasn't something that just happened overnight. And, you know, once when the internet kind of took off and we got our first computer and I went online and looked up some of these churches and some of these groups for people who came out of abusive, quote-unquote, Christian homes, and I started finding out that, hey, this has happened to other people too. You know, other people understand what this feels like. Other people understand what it's like to have to hide the sexual abuse or hide the domestic violence that you've grown up with. And, you know, in our case, in the church that we grew up with, as long as you paid your tithes, then that's what that's what the elders looked at, not the fact that you're beating your kids, but he's a big tithe payer, so we'll let that slip by.
Oh,
No
dreadful.
concern at all to what the children are going to, just the fact that, well, they're paying his tithe, so that's okay.
Absolutely disgusting. It's horrible, isn't it? It's getting all the priorities wrong, isn't it? And it's just, there was a I actually sent it. I'll try and send it to you if I can find it online. It's I sent away for a little poster print. I don't know if you're familiar with a painting called The Broad and Narrow Way, and I remember this in my old church, which was quite different from yours, but again, sort of like, no shopping on a Sunday, and don't do this and don't do that. And there was this massive picture in a frame at the back of the hall in the church. And as a kid, this was petrifying, because right at the top, you've got this big eye in, I think it's a triangle. Are you familiar with this, The Broad and the Narrow Way, Nancy?
Yeah.
Are you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and isn't it?
What's kind of funny is, you're talking about that. My mother and dad always had this painting of the Last Supper.
Oh, yeah.
Everything we did, every birthday party, every anniversary, any graduation, all the pictures were taken in front of the Last Supper picture.
Oh, right.
And so it's just one more reminder as a child growing up that you can't talk about what goes on, because that would be displeasing to God. So you've got to keep these secrets, because everything that happens in front of the Last Supper. So you can't talk about sexual abuse. You can't talk about dad beating mom. You can't talk about mom, waking dad up in the middle of the night and kicking him half to death. You can't talk about all those things, because we are a Christian family. And Christian families don't talk about these bad things, see.
No.
We just act like they don't exist, even though they do. And none of this will stop until we break that part.
Yeah.
Till we get to the point and raise our kids that it's okay to tell, because the only way these things are going to stop is when we talk about it.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, amen to that, yeah. Yeah, that's right. And it needs some, pioneers like yourself to break the way for others, because it's that's very crafty, isn't it? That whole, like you say, if you stood in front of the Last Supper, that's again extra manipulation as to, how it's got to be.
I know, it was my first therapist out when I first showed her, because I had told her about this, and so I dug out a few pictures, and there it was. Every birthday was right in front of this religious picture. Every single one. And it was, kind of like that all-seeing eye. It was that, well, we're a Christian home, so we can't talk about all the bad things that's happening. We'll just, shut the door on that and pretend like it doesn't happen. But when you do that, that continues to abuse.
Yeah. Would have been.
There's no way for that to stop until somebody actually is honest and says, yes, this is happening in our house.
Yeah. And it would have been easier all round. There would have been nothing to hide, would there? If this just didn't happen in the first place. Let's make it easier and nicer and save you all this pain for the future, bad memories. It's the long-term effect. The fact that it's given you bad memories of childhood and all the surgery, and just don't do it in the first place. Do you know what I mean? It's why do people need to be so horrible?
Well, I've said this from the time that I started therapy on, is that when you put such an emphasis on everything being perfect, like there was in the denomination I grew up in, then you're going to see these cracks, because we're human. God made us human.
Yeah.
We're not perfect. And so when there is, I'm not saying that you should just go out and do whatever you want, don't get me wrong, but when we put such a high pressure on people to be perfect, it's impossible.
Yeah.
And so you do start cracking, and then when you add in, it's kind of like making a big cake. You add in some eggs and flour. Well, when you add in, how we have a disastrous home life, well, you put an emphasis on having to be perfect, and you throw a little bit of, what happens at home stays at home, and you can't talk about it, so the kids have to keep their mouth shut at all times. And then you throw in a little bit of, we can't tell the neighbors that the, cops were here late at night. We can't talk about that either. We got to deny that. And then we throw in teachers asking questions. Well, we can't have that, so Mom and Dad move so that the teachers don't ask questions. Pretty soon you have what we did, a family that's literally coming apart.
Yeah. And it's avoiding the issue, isn't it? It's just running away. So you can run, but you can't hide, sort of thing.
And then if it is like my family, you've got several generations of abuse, and that's what I wanted to do to stop that cycle. Because at least with my mom, I know the abuse goes back several generations.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was going to... shame we haven't got time to talk about that more, because that was one thing. Maybe we can do a future show about that. I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
Yeah, and, I'm just throwing this out there also, if there is another time for a future show. I would love to be able to talk a little bit about because I've been asked this a lot on the posts that I've gotten from people, and that is what signs to look for a child who is being abused.
Oh, okay.
Because kids do tell, but they don't generally just walk up to you and say, "Hey, I'm being sexually abused." That's not how they tell.
Yeah.
But kids do have signs that we can look for, and I've been asked about that a lot on my website, so maybe if we do a future show, we could also talk about that.
Yeah, I would love to. Let's do that.
I think that would help other people.
Yeah, it would.
Because one thing, may not be an abused child, but if you start seeing 5 or 6 things in this child, then your possibilities this child is being hurt is pretty high.
Yeah.
And there are things that we as teachers, neighbors, aunts, uncles, teachers at school, teachers at church, that we could be looking for if we know what to look for.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, Nancy, we'll do a show on that. This hour has gone so quickly, but yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. If you're up for that, I'd be more than willing to do that.
Sounds great.
It's been an absolute honour to chat with you again, and thank you so much for what you're doing, speaking up about these dreadful things, and raising awareness, and encouraging others to have the strength to speak up too. You're such.
Well, I appreciate you allowing me to come and chat with you again. It's been a pleasure. I love listening to your accent.
I love listening to yours.
Wonderful.
Do you know, I'm not very good with...
I do appreciate you allowing me to speak with you again and to get more of the word out, and hopefully, people can understand and hear that there's hope in this, that even if you were abused growing up, it doesn't have to affect your life forever.
Yeah.
Healing is out there, and it is possible.
Amen to that. That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Nancy. I'm very proud to call you my friend. God richly bless you. And to the audience at home, thank you for tuning in. And until next time, much love and God bless.